The 2014 Oso landslide in Washington started on March 22nd after heavy rainfall saturated the soil. A massive section of the hillside gave away, sending millions of cubic feet of mud and debris hurtling downhill at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. The slide buried an area nearly 1 square mile, sweeping away 49 homes in a small community called Steelhead Haven, along the Stillaguamish River. Witnesses described it as a fast-moving wall of mud that tore through everything in its path, including homes, trees, and the landscape itself. The damage was catastrophic. 43 lives were lost, making it one of the deadliest single landslides in U.S. history. The landslide also blocked the Stillaguamish River, triggering upstream flooding and closing State Route 530, the main road to the nearby towns. Emergency crews, volunteers, and even Navy search and rescue teams worked tirelessly to recover victims and assist survivors, while residents were evacuated due to ongoing risks. Surprisingly, the site had a history of landslides dating back decades, with warnings from experts as early as 1937. The hillside was considered unstable, but no large-scale precautions were taken. This tragedy became a wake-up call for authorities, leading to improved regulations for monitoring landslide-prone areas and assessing risks. Today, the site serves as both a memorial for the victims and a reminder of the importance of environmental awareness in vulnerable regions. In June 2013, relentless rainfall triggered massive floods and landslides in Uttarakhand, including Kedarnath, one of India's most revered pilgrimage sites. A cloudburst near the Himalayas caused rivers to swell and mountainsides to collapse, wiping out villages, roads, and the area around the Kedarnath temple. Over 6,000 lives were lost, and many bodies were never recovered, leaving families in mourning and disbelief. The environmental damage was also catastrophic. Deforestation, unchecked construction, and melting glaciers worsened the impact, as hillsides weakened and crumbled under the weight of excessive rainfall. Sacred spots, settlements, and roads were buried under debris. Witnesses recalled hearing rocks and boulders thundering down, sweeping everything into the raging rivers. Survivors clung to trees or boulders for days without food, water, or communication, as mobile towers and infrastructure were completely washed away. An expert panel later highlighted the need for sustainable development and limited pilgrim numbers to reduce stress on the fragile Himalayan ecosystem. Despite recommendations, the influx of pilgrims has only surged, often exceeding the carrying capacity of the valleys. In response to the tragedy, efforts like reforestation and early warning systems were introduced, though experts argue that much more needs to be done. The Kedarnath landslide remains a stark reminder of the deadly consequences of ignoring environmental limits and highlights the urgent need for responsible tourism and development in vulnerable regions. On February 17, 2006, the village of Guinsagan in southern Leyte, Philippines, was buried by a catastrophic mudslide following 10 days of relentless rain. A minor earthquake, just hours before, added to the instability of the already saturated soil. Within moments, rocks, mud, and debris thundered down from Mount Canabag, wiping out the entire community. One of the most heartbreaking moments was the burial of the local elementary school, where classes were in session. Of the 246 students and teachers, only 2 survived. The slide claimed over 1,100 lives, including villagers attending a community celebration nearby. Survivors described hearing a deafening rumble before their homes were engulfed. Roads were blocked by chest-deep mud, bridges collapsed, and rescuers faced an uphill battle, slowed by the ongoing rains and unstable ground. Relief teams from the Philippine Red Cross and international aid organizations arrived quickly. Countries like the US, China, and the Australia pledged financial and logistical support, while Malaysia and Spain sent specialized rescue teams and dogs. Experts blamed heavy rainfall and possibly decades-old logging and mining in the region. However, local officials denied deforestation played a major role. Scientists agreed that the downpour loosened the already fragile soil, triggering the slide, but questions remained about the exact cause. The disaster highlighted the urgent need for relocating vulnerable communities and improving early warning systems in landslide-prone areas. The village of Guinsagan remains a haunting reminder of nature's unpredictable power. In December 1999, Venezuela's Vargas state faced a catastrophic series of floods and landslides following days of torrential rain. Over 900 millimeters of rain fell in just 3 days, an entire year's worth, triggering thousands of landslides along the mountainous coastline. Rivers turned violent, carrying boulders, mud, and debris straight into towns and cities. Entire neighborhoods like Los Corrales and Cerro Grande were wiped out. While buildings collapsed, roads vanished, and the coastline was reshaped. The Caramboleta fan, heavily urbanized and sitting at the mouth of the San Julian ravine, was hit hardest. Floodwaters overwhelmed the concrete channels meant to divert debris and instead spilled through streets, smashing into homes and leaving 6-meter-thick deposits of boulders and mud. Many survivors recalled how entire apartment floors disappeared as the debris tore through buildings. The death toll reached 10,000 to 30,000 lives, with bodies washed out to sea or buried under layers of mud. Up to 75,000 people were left homeless. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, though efforts were hampered by the scale of destruction. International aid poured in, with countries like the US and Cuba sending medical teams, supplies, and military assistance. The government evacuated over 100,000 people and called for long-term recovery. However, rebuilding was slow, and political delays disrupted major infrastructure plans. Even today, survivors remembered the devastation, while the tragedy serves as a reminder of the consequences of uncontrolled development in fragile landscapes. On November 13, 1985, Nevado del Ruiz erupted in Colombia after 69 years of dormancy. Although experts warned of its activity, poor communication and lack of preparation left residents of Armero vulnerable. The eruption sent pyroclastic flows, melting the mountain's glaciers, creating massive mudflows that rushed down its slopes at 50 kilometers an hour. These mudflows smashed through valleys, wiping out Armero and burying over 20,000 people in thick mud. The tragedy could have been prevented. Hazard maps showed Armero as a danger zone, but they were either poorly distributed or misinterpreted. Heavy rains on the day of the eruption added to the confusion. Some residents were told to stay inside to avoid ashfall, unaware of the imminent mudflows. By the time the Lawhers arrived, it was too late. Survivors described the horrifying scene. Buildings collapsed, and the thick mud trapped people as it filled wounds and suffocated them. Relief workers struggled to move through the sticky mud, arriving nearly 12 hours later. Footage of Armero Sanchez, a young girl trapped under rubble, became the face of the disaster, sparking outrage over the government's response. The event claimed over 23,000 lives and devastated several towns. In response, Colombia established a national disaster management system to monitor volcanoes and improve evacuation plans. Nevado del Ruiz remains active, but communities now take volcanic warnings seriously, ensuring the lessons from Armero's tragedy are not forgotten. On October 21, 1966, tragedy struck the Welsh village of Aberfan when a coal spoil tip collapsed, triggered by weeks of heavy rain. The massive landslide, made up of 140,000 cubic yards of waterlogged coal waste, raced downhill at high speed, engulfing Panglas Junior School and nearby houses. It killed 116 children and 28 adults within minutes. Most victims were between 7 and 10 years old. The spoil tip, managed by the National Coal Board, aka NCB, had been built on unstable ground above a natural spring, which everyone in the area knew about. Despite earlier warnings and small slips, no action was taken to stabilize it. That morning, the dark wave of slurry struck just as lessons began, trapping children and teachers beneath tons of sludge. Local residents and miners rushed to dig with bare hands, but only a handful of survivors were pulled out alive after the first few hours. The disaster sparked national outrage. A public inquiry blamed the NCB for negligence, criticizing their failure to act and dismissing the chairman's claim that nobody knew about the spring. Compensation was slow, with bereaved families offered just £500, a sum seen as insulting. The tragedy led to changes in mining laws under the Mines and Quarries Tips Act 1969, which introduced stricter regulations to ensure spoil tip safety. Over time, the disaster fund helped rebuild the community, while the memorial garden now stands where the school once was, honoring the lives lost. On July 9th, 1958, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck along Alaska's Fairweather Fault, shaking the mountains around Lituya Bay. The quake triggered a massive rock slide. About 30 million cubic meters of debris plunged into the narrow bay, creating a wave so powerful that it swept up to 1,720 feet above sea level. That's higher than the Burj Khalifa, and remains the tallest tsunami ever recorded. Witnesses described the moment as an explosion. Bill Swanson, anchored nearby, watched the Lituya Glacier appear to lift into the air, pieces of ice falling like rocks into the water. Seconds later, a wall of water surged through the bay. Howard Ulrich and his 7-year-old son were lifted hundreds of feet in their boat by the wave, but miraculously survived. The tsunami stripped trees and vegetation along the shoreline, leaving a barren, high water mark still visible today. Forests were destroyed, glaciers were damaged, and the bay's seafloor was dramatically altered. 5 people lost their lives, and nearby towns like Yakutat reported infrastructure damage. What caused such a colossal wave? Scientists determined that the falling rock hit with such force that it displaced a huge amount of water and sediment, like a boulder dropped into a pond. Later studies suggested the earthquake also destabilized trapped glacier ice and sediment, releasing an even bigger second slide. This event remains a critical case study for understanding megatsunamis, showing that landslides and rock falls can trigger waves with unimaginable power. On December 16, 1920, a massive earthquake struck Haiyuan County in China's Ningxia region, registering 7.9 magnitude. The tremor shook the ground so violently that over 50,000 landslides cascaded across the region, burying entire villages and changing the landscape forever. The quake hit the hardest in rural areas where many families lived in cave-like homes dug into the lowest soil, a fine, compact sediment that proved especially vulnerable to collapse. The destruction was staggering. Over 73,000 people in Haiyuan alone lost their lives, while nearby towns like Gaiyuan reported tens of thousands of deaths. Cities like Lanzhou and Xi'an also suffered significant damage. In some areas, more than 70% of structures were destroyed, leaving survivors without homes or food as winter set in. The frigid temperatures claimed even more lives as people huddled in makeshift shelters, afraid to rebuild because of constant aftershocks. Survivors described landslides swallowing roads and rivers, changing their course. Many roamed the altered landscape, vulnerable to starvation and bandit attacks. Relief efforts were limited, with regional armies led by General Ma Fuxiang stepping in as first responders. Soldiers distributed tents and supplies, while local gentry and officials set up soup kitchens and reopened granaries. Unfortunately, the disaster coincided with a major drought famine elsewhere in China, which drained national resources. Despite being one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, relief and reconstruction efforts remained a fraction of what was needed. Which landslide story impacted you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you'd like to see a part 2 exploring more landslide events. Join us next time as we delve deeper into the events that have shaped our world, because every landslide has a story worth telling.